auction, giving away or staging an illegal auction, is this accurate? To sell off parcels of land near protected territories or national parks or?
Yeah, the parcels of land were kind of strewn throughout eastern Utah. It was kind of controversial because a lot of them were right around arches and canyonlands, national parks, and places that people in Utah had a really deep connection to. But it was also a much larger auction than had ever happened before. So the Bush administration spent their 8 years rewriting their long-term resource management plans. And so they had rushed them to get them done so that they could have one auction at the end of their administration that was under these new rules. So there were all these areas that had previously been considered off limits for oil drilling. So they rewrote all those laws, which took a long time. They rewrote all that, and now everything was on the table. And so it was a massive auction for lots of mineral rights leases. So it's not just for the land itself, but for the mineral rights underneath them.
To dig.
Yeah. So this was kind of their one chance to get everything in the hands of the oil industry before Obama took office.
I'm going to try to stay objective. So.
Okay.
Maybe I don't need to, not in this present company, but so how did you originally hear about it? I just want to sort of go back through some of where you were, and how you heard about the event, the auction, and kind of the mind frame you were in going into the event and that kind of thing, just to help us understand how something like this transpires.
Yeah. Well, I was an economics student at the University of Utah at the time. And the University of Utah is ironically one of the most progressive economics programs in the country, one of the few that teaches anything other than neoliberal economics. And so I actually heard about this auction in part through some of the environmental groups that I was a part of, but also from some of my classes. And at the time, I'd had my kind of existential crisis moment around climate change about 9 months earlier, and had been through that period of despair, and had come out of that with an increased commitment to really taking bold action. And that fall I was also studying social movement history, and seeing that at that point in 2008, the climate movement looked very different than any successful social movement in our history, because the climate movement was really trying to appease those in power, and say, oh, we can have this cleaner, greener version of the world that we have now, and keep everything else about our power structures the same, and trying to reach the people who are at the top of our current power structures and appease them, rather than confront that power structure and pressure them to make change, which is what most social movements that have made major changes done. And so I saw the need for things like civil disobedience and more confrontational action. So I was looking for opportunities.
Okay, great. So so this is something you're theorizing about, you're reading, you're studying, you're thinking about this.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I was also talking to other people. There were other people in my community, like folks in my Unitarian church and other students, who were having a similar kind of existential crisis around climate change at the time.
What is the year? Sorry, I gotta turn up the computer.
It's 2008. So it was kind of closely following the period when scientists were learning that a lot of their worst case scenario projections were in fact overly optimistic. And so 2007 and in early 2008 was when James Hansen first came out with the paper calling for 350 parts per million. So it's where that paradigm first started coming out of people saying, oh, wait a minute, everything is changing much faster than we expected. And so that was kind of sinking into me and a lot of folks in my community in 2008.
And meanwhile, but just to contextualize, so 2008 was when the financial collapse happened.
Right.
And so sitting here in New York City, the news we were getting, what we were focused on was the financial collapse, Wall Street, crisis of greed, and we were really focused a lot on the financial aspect of things. And I think some of the environmental messages that were coming out at that time were getting lost.
Right, and that was in the fall of 2008 when the economy was collapsing, and that was certainly, you know, a big part of what I was seeing, and an interesting time to be an economics student.
Definitely.
For sure. I mean,
Yeah.
I had a take-home exam where the answer to the question actually changed while we had the exam, and it was like a fundamental question about where monetary policy comes from. Like, it was so it was a weird time, but also a time of sort of like upending a lot of conventionalism, and so it also seemed like a time of possibility.
Yeah.
You know, there was the feeling, I think, a lot in 2008 of like, oh, we're going to learn the lessons of this. You know, like, oh, this is going to be a wake-up call for us. You know, Alan Greenspan testified before Congress and said, you know, I just really can't understand how everyone operating in their own best interest didn't lead to the best result for society. I just can't wrap my head around it. You know, like all the like Marxist professors in my economics department were like, well, we can understand that. We've been teaching about that. You know, so there was this sense of like, oh, that paradigm failed. There's the opportunity for a new paradigm here. You know, that didn't exactly happen, but
Not yet.
yeah, there was a sense of possibility, and you know, it also, you know, as a climate activist, I felt rather disconnected to this like movement of appeasement, and it also felt like we just needed some kind of catalyst to push things,
So interesting.
and so I was kind of looking for opportunities and like going to hearings and things like that, looking for the opportunity to do civil disobedience or something effective, and usually leaving feeling rather impotent. And so this auction rolled around, and there was some sentiment against it, some people speaking out against it. There was a rally planned outside. And I had a final exam in economics that morning, and one of the questions on the exam was, in this BLM auction that's happening later today, if it's only oil and gas men in the room, will the final prices reflect the true cost of developing oil? And so it was a question about all the externalities of oil development that are not incorporated into the costs of production. And so that just sort of like even more solidified it for me, that yes, there needs to be more than just oil and gas men in the room for this auction. And so I went there with just a vague intention of doing something to disrupt this process. And I saw some people that I knew in the rally outside, which was, you know, just people like holding signs, walking back and forth. And I said, well, inside is where the action's at. Let's go in there and see what we can do. And they said, no, you can't do that. There's security. They'll just drag you out the door. And I said, okay, well then let's go get dragged out by security and at least like make that statement with our actions. And they said, no, we can't do that. And so I went in alone, and the security said, hi, are you here for the auction? I said, yes, I am. He directed me to a table, and another official there said, are you here to be a bidder? And I said, well, yes, I am. And got signed up to be a bidder. And
Stop.
still with
Are
the
you
intention.
thinking at this point, or are you just moving?
I'm
What's happening here?
So one of the things I was thinking about, you know, before that, I think it was earlier that year, I had been to a hearing about a renewable energy bill in Utah, and it was, you know, the climate movement there kind of mobilized for this bill, and so the room was packed, overflowing, and they were taking public comment, and at the beginning of that, they said, how many people are here to support this bill? And like most of the hands went up, like 100 people in this room. They said, how many people are here to oppose this bill? 5 hands went up, and they were all from industry lobbyists. And so the chairman of the committee said, well, in the interest of fairness, let's take, say, 5 speakers from each side. And so all of the industry lobbyists got to speak. And 5 out of the 100 people who were there to support the bill got to speak. And that was mostly like for the professional environmentalists. And so they were like, no, you don't speak, you just like let us speak for you. And they didn't say anything close to what I wanted to say. And the bill died there in committee that day. And so I left there really pissed off. And I was going home with a friend of mine, and she said, well, have you ever heard about these guys called the Yes Men? She said, they pretend to be the people who have a right to speak, and like whose voices are valued in society, and they go and like they tell the real truth about what those people are doing. And so then I went and looked up the Yes Men and started looking at some of the stuff that they had done, like pretending to be Dow Chemical, and pretending to be the WTO, and speaking at like major forums as these corporations or these entities. And then I said, the next time if somebody asks if I'm one of the people who have a right to have a voice in this venue, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to and so I left that, like after that hearing, I was like, next time I'm going to say that I'm one of those guys. And so then, as soon as they asked me, are you here to be a bidder? I was like, yes, I am. And kind of had that inspiration of the Yes Men in my mind. But I was still thinking, okay, I can sign up to be a bidder so that I can get inside the room and make some kind of disruption or like yell something or like make a speech or it was right after that guy threw a shoe at Bush, so I kind of had that in the back. Maybe I can throw a shoe at somebody. And it wasn't until I actually got in the auction room and saw how things were working that I was like, holy shit, I can really mess this thing up with this bid card that they gave me. Because all you had to do is like just raise the little bid card, and they've got like the auctioneer up there in his cowboy hat talking really fast. And so then it was just a process of making that decision of whether or not I was going to take that action.
And that's the moment I have to just stop, because that occurred to me in hearing you say that. Again, the mind waffles, the mind doesn't settle. You were having like, should I do this, should I do that, should I do this, should I do that? But the moment it focuses on something, on an action, then you said you were clear.
Well,
I love that.
I saw the opportunity there, and so then it was a period of deciding whether or not to take that opportunity. And so that was sort of like weighing the like, should I do this, should I not? And on the one hand, I was looking at this and saying, if I do this, I'll probably go to prison for a couple of years and have to declare bankruptcy or something like that. And could I live with that? And it didn't take me too long to say, well, that would suck, but yeah, I could live with that. Like I could live with a couple of years in prison. And then on the other hand, if I don't do this, if I don't take this opportunity that's in front of me, and we continue on our current trajectory, and our world continues to fall apart, and 20, 30 years down the line, I meet some young person who's born into this broken world, and they ask me like what I was doing back in 2008 and why I didn't take opportunities that I had. Could I live with knowing that I had that opportunity and I didn't take it? And that's what I wrestled with for like a good 15 or 20 minutes. And I finally decided that no, I couldn't live with that. And that I had to take this action. And so I started just driving up the prices. And so I would wait till it got down to one bidder, and it was like going once, going twice, and then I would jump in. And I was kind of like playing poker with the other bidder to try to read when he was at his maximum level, and I would get out before I won anything. And I was successful at that. Like there were parcels that I drove up an order of magnitude. Like it would be going once, going twice at $15 an acre. And then I would jump in and we'd go back and forth. And I got out at $240 an acre. And he's still going strong. And this is for a parcel of like 2,000 acres. And, you know, so afterwards, I'd be like some little quick math in my head, and I'd be like, well, I just cost that oil company like $500,000 in 5 minutes. This is the most effective thing I've ever done. But then at the same time, I was like, but it's still worth it for them. Like, they're still going to develop that oil. They obviously, like, yeah, they had some collusion here where they were getting it for pennies on the dollar, but they still know that it's worth it at the dollar. And I knew that I could be doing more. And so then at the halfway point of the auction, when half the parcels were gone, that's when I was like, all right, I've got to win the rest of them. And so I started just winning parcels. And I wasn't being subtle. I'd still gone in with that mindset of like protest and causing disruption. So you only have to like do a little flick of the bid card to make a bid. And I started like raising it up more and more. And before long I was like raising it above my head. And then I stopped taking it down in between bids. And just like held it up there constantly. After I'd won 14 parcels in a row, then they finally stopped the auction. And when they stopped the auction, the auctioneer said, oh, we're going to take a little break, use the restroom, whatever you need to do. And as soon as he said that, there was a guy standing next to me showing a badge, saying, I'm a federal agent, can we go talk outside? And so he took me into another part of the building, and he showed me this printout of all the parcels that I'd won. It's like, so you don't seem to be one of our normal bidders. You're not bidding like folks normally do in this. You've won about $1.8 million. And, we're just wondering like what your intentions are and how you plan on paying for this and making the down payment and stuff. And I said, well, my intention is to disrupt this auction in any way that I can because it's a fraud against the American people and a threat to my future.
Wow.
And he was like, so you don't plan on paying for this? I said, no, nor do I have the ability to. And then he brought over like another agent, and this guy was like, so you're not going to pay for this? And then they took me into custody and took me into another part of the building. And they debated whether or not to re-auction the parcels. But since some of the oil companies had already left in frustration, they realized that they couldn't just put them back up on the auction block because those people would get pissed that they weren't there and didn't have the same opportunity. And they had to give 30 days public notice to re-auction or to auction any parcels. And that was Friday afternoon on December 19th of 2008. And they couldn't get their act together on Friday afternoon, so like the next business day then was December 22nd, which 30 days later would put it after January 19th of 2009, which was when Obama took office.
The timing is so...
So they didn't sell them?
No, and so that's actually a continuing to develop of what happened to those parcels. So then, when Obama came into office, things were still up in the air and still in limbo. And he appointed his new Secretary of the Interior, Ken Salazar. Ken Salazar's first act as Secretary of the Interior was to invalidate almost that entire auction. Like not just the parcels that I won, but almost all the others as well. So he rescinded all those parcels and admitted that the government wasn't following their own rules in the first place.
Is that after your trial?
No, I hadn't even been charged with anything at that point.
Okay.
So it was after that I was prosecuted. And so then things were still kind of up in the air with those parcels, where then a few months later they said, well, we've looked into this more, and some of these parcels could be eligible for future leasing. Some of them are probably never appropriate. And it also caused like a re-investigation of the long-term resource management plans that the Bush administration wrote. And so then just last month, the Department of the Interior came out with a new mineral leasing plan for that whole district of the Bureau of Land Management, which takes all those parcels off the table for leasing. And it, or at least all the ones that I was bidding on, it takes those off. And that's still a draft thing, so it's not finalized yet. And there's also more of a movement that is paying attention to the program of fossil fuel development on public lands in this country. And so just yesterday I was down in Washington, D.C. with a big coalition of huge national climate groups, over 400 different organizations, that it was called the Keep It in the Ground campaign, that is calling for an end to fossil fuel leasing on federal lands. And they found that just the unleased stuff on federal lands that could be eligible in the future represents 450 gigatons of CO2 emissions. And the stuff that's already been leased, that hasn't been developed yet, but is already in the hands of the fossil fuel industry, is already 40 gigatons of CO2 emissions. To put that in perspective, Obama's Clean Power Plan would, if it was fully implemented and worked perfectly, it would cut 5 gigatons of CO2 emissions by 2030. And so there's this huge amount of carbon emissions that is locked up in that leasing program. And so now the movement is at the point of actually calling for the end of that program.
Anybody have any questions? Yeah, Nasli?
I have this guess that sometimes this really like you kind of say the government to harm the nature that they were not supposed to be doing, and I still don't understand why they accused you with that. Like at the end, like even though I heard what your lawyers were saying, I still can't put it to the low statement of why they could do such things. Like, I don't know. Maybe it's me, I'm not from here, but
Well, it was a political prosecution, driven by politics, and so they prosecuted me because I challenged their authority, and so it was very much about power, and who has the power to shape what happens in this country, and so you saw in the film that my trial was delayed, and during that time I was like organizing with Peaceful Uprising and speaking out that whole time. So in my sentencing hearing, the judge, who was very much an ideologue, gave like a 30-minute lecture about his views on this, and it was a lot about the rule of law and that sort of thing. But he also said that my actual actions themselves weren't that big of a deal. But the fact that I had spoken out against the government for that 2.5 years and had been encouraging other people to challenge the government was why I needed to have a strong sentence. And he said that from what he knew about the case, if it hadn't been for my continuing trail of public statements, I wouldn't have been prosecuted in the first place. So that came from the judge, and that was very much what I saw throughout the whole process. That this was about power and showing who's in charge.
But they admitted that they did wrong. Sorry.
Yeah,
Sounds like it.
yeah. I mean, the government admitted that auction was illegitimate. Yeah, but that I still didn't have a right to stand in the way of it. Was basically their position.
I have a question. I learned a lot about activism and yes men and preventionists. And we see a lot about planning. And yes men spend months planning. So I don't want to say do you regret it because I hate living in the past. But if you had the opportunity to plan, I'm calling it your activist, interventionist, do you think you would have did things differently?
Or moving forward.
Afterwards, afterwards I got very connected to a lot of the climate movement because of all this, it was probably like a year later that that I was talking with a guy named Matt Leonard, who at the time worked for Greenpeace, and he's like one of the best direct action folks in the climate movement. Does a lot of trainings. He now works for 350. He said, you know, if I'd have trained you, you never would have done that because you did everything wrong. He's like, by the book that we train people, you did everything wrong. You know, like the fact that I spoke openly to the police and the media afterwards about what I had done. That like I didn't have a support system set up beforehand. You know, I didn't have an exit strategy, and that sort of thing. But I think that was actually part of the power of it. You know, one, that it was outside of any like existing narratives that come from like all these carefully planned things. And so that allowed me to create the narrative on my terms. You know, so the first person who was framing what this whole thing was of like bidding as an act of protest, which nobody had ever heard of. The first person who was framing that was me, talking about who I was and why I was doing this, and why it was necessary. And so that put my opponents of the industry and their lobbyists and all those folks in the position of trying to reframe an existing narrative, which is a real position of disadvantage. And normally that's the position that we're in as activists, of trying to like reframe some existing narrative about how you know, this power plant is going to create jobs, and we're like trying to reframe it to some other perspective, and that's very difficult to do. And I'd say that they weren't able to do that in my case. You know, the conservative right-wing politicians in Utah initially tried to come out in opposition to me, and there was one who's like the most vile right-wing anti-environment guy in Utah who called me an eco-terrorist once, and he never did it again. And that was like early 2009 that he said that. And he never did again. And after that, he was like very friendly to me. And a lot of the like right-wing folks in Utah have like expressed their respect for what I was doing.
Why do you were just gonna say because?
Well, because
On a human level?
on a human level, and because a lot of their base of grassroots conservatives saw my case as a story of the federal government overreaching their bounds. You know, the federal government abusing their power and one individual standing up against them, which was a narrative that conservatives really liked. And so then the right-wing power players weren't able to really vilify me because their own supporters kind of respected me. And so you know, that was one thing about no planning. It was that it created a new narrative. You know, the other thing was that like the reason that that activists are told to plan stuff is because it makes it safer. Like you develop an exit strategy and all that kind of stuff. And so I was in a position, because I didn't plan, I was in a genuinely vulnerable position. Like I was actually in over my head. And I was able to mobilize a pretty significant movement there in Utah that was really committed and that not only supported me and mobilized around my trial, but also fought a lot of other issues around that same time, and created a lot of new space for activism. Like that organization created a lot of new space in Utah, and then also created a shift sort of in the national climate movement. But the interesting thing about that was that the people who were most committed to organizing around that effort, like the people during that period that did some of the most serious work, weren't already climate activists. They weren't people like from the movement who stepped in and helped this. Probably the biggest demographic by far, the people who were really seriously committed, were women around my mother's age.
Yeah.
And I think that was because they could associate me with their
The
kids.
children, yeah.
And they saw that I was actually in a vulnerable position, that I actually needed their help. You know, like, things would have been much worse for me if I had not had a big support network in Utah. And that genuine vulnerability became a real source of power then for action. And, you know, and I think with the civil disobedience that has become popular in the climate movement, which wasn't at the time, like there's been a huge shift in the mainstream of the movement embracing a certain kind of civil disobedience. But a lot of that is what I call photo op style civil disobedience, that, you know, has a certain part of the value of civil disobedience in creating spectacle, but it lacks any genuine vulnerability, and it substitutes perceived risk for actual risk. And so I think it lacks some of the real movement building potential that actions with vulnerability have.
That's really interesting. I never thought about, I mean, you hear about these actions and you tend to focus on the courage or, you know, how strong you must be to have done such a thing, but this aspect of vulnerability is really beautiful. It gives a new dimension, a different dimension to the act.
Yeah, and I think, you know, some of the really powerful, iconic actions and disruptions did have a degree of spontaneity to them, and like you couldn't imagine like the Tiananmen Square tank man like sitting down and going through an action planning worksheet
Right.
ahead of time of like,
Or Rosa Parks.
like what's the best way to express the fact that like no matter how many guns and tanks you have, you're never going to crush our spirit. Like what would be a good action to get that across? Like nobody knows who the tank man was, right? But like I can bet that he was probably not sitting down with people going through that kind of planning process. And that's part of the power of that moment, is that it seemed like such a genuine expression of where somebody was really at. And I think a lot of times when we do a lot of planning around stuff, we separate our really genuine passion for this work from what ends up coming out as an action. And the action looks a little sterilized, it looks a little artificial, and our genuine spirit doesn't really come through with it.
So can I ask you something then?
Yeah.
It seems like, so now you're studying, or have you finished your studies?
I'm kind of on sabbatical.
Okay.
I mean, I finished my economics degree.
Right.
I did finish
No,
that.
To the
Yeah.
ministry.
And so I've been at Harvard Divinity School for the past 2 years.
Okay.
And so I'm taking a year off from that.
Okay. Because what I thought was interesting was you spoke, in something that I watched, a video that I watched, you spoke about the interchange that needs to happen for all of us and some ideological changes that need to happen. One clip I watched, you were talking about the concept of enough. I don't know if you remember that, but it feels like, I wonder if do you believe that, or is part of your path into the ministry about preparing more people inwardly to see clearly what's going on, to be clearer about the moral imperative that we have right now?
You know, I think part of my path to divinity school was kind of looking for a different set of tools and skills. You know, it really grew out of that 2.5 years that is depicted in the film where I'm kind of doing full-time climate activism. And during that time I saw that the role of the climate movement was shifting, and the goal was shifting to where it wasn't just about reducing emissions, but we also had this challenge on top of that. It was increasingly emerging of how do we maintain our humanity as we navigate this period of rapid and chaotic change that is now largely inevitable. And you know, particularly after 2009, that grew more and more obvious that that it's too late to stop climate change. And so looking around the climate movement, I realized that we didn't have any of the tools and skills to talk about how we maintain our humanity as we navigate a desperate situation. But I felt like our religious traditions did have a certain set of tools and skills for that. That I think are necessary not only for the resilience piece of that, of surviving this, but also about the resistance piece of doing this still necessary work of actually standing up against the fossil fuel industry and moving us off of that path. Because that's like that resistance, if we're honest about it, like implicit in any goals of climate justice means keeping the vast majority of fossil fuels that are now on the books of the fossil fuel industry in the ground. So in other words, like implicit in our goals is that we intend to cost the richest and most powerful industry in the world trillions of dollars of lost future profits that they intend on making. And we intend it to cost some of the individuals at the top of that industry, like the Koch brothers, billions of dollars of lost future profits. And this is an industry that has killed people for money for as long as it has existed. Like in West Virginia, where I'm from, they have literally been killing people for money for 150 years.
Coal mines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they don't and they don't care. And and increasingly, because it's difficult to convince people to blow up their backyards or poison their own water when they're free people who have other options, they've increasingly been killing democracy in order to be able to continue killing people for money, like we've seen in Colorado, where they've prevented local municipalities from having a say in whether or not they have fracking in their own communities. So we're dealing with an extremely ruthless industry that knows they have a lot to lose. And so if we're at all successful of our goal of keeping those fossil fuels in the ground, there will be backlash. And like regardless of what role we play or what tactics we're using, like whether we're doing what we consider to be risky tactics of civil disobedience or not, if we're actually successful at costing that industry money, there will be backlash. And so there's something kind of absurd about taking on that kind of challenge. Like there's something like our conventional, like reasonable wisdom says, don't do that. Don't pick a fight with the richest and most powerful industry in the world with a history of killing people for money. Like that doesn't make sense on a certain level. And I think to have real commitment for that kind of job, we need a system that goes beyond just what like our normal secular system of what's reasonable. Like we need a system of values that's not necessarily based on a positive outcome for ourselves as an individual. And to me, that's what it means to be religious. Like I don't really see the dichotomy as being between the religious and the secular. For me, the dichotomy is between the religious and the expedient. Like those who do things because they can see a clear path of a positive outcome, and it's expedient. And those who do things because they believe that it must be done, that they're the right thing to do.
So how are we gonna get there? Exactly. Well, and I should say, first of all, I think it's happening.
Yeah.
Like whenever I think it's happening, the question is it happening fast enough? Like there's a growing, like consciousness is evolving, or whatever you wanna, however you wanna talk about it. Like we are getting it. I've been doing climate focus groups with millennials. That, are you a millennial? You're a millennial.
Yeah, I'm borderline.
You're a cusper.
I'm 1981.
Okay, yeah, you are, officially.
Yeah.
So millennials get the oneness, our interconnectedness
Right.
in a way that previous the last few generations just
Yeah.
didn't get. If you talk to my parents about, if you say we are one, they're like, okay,
Right.
all right, hippie or whatever.
Yeah. So, I think some
But
of
we're
the,
getting it,
I
right?
think some
But
of that shift is
fast enough?
Yeah, no, not fast enough.
Right.
But I think there's also a degree to which, like, in addition to that kind of shift in consciousness, there's also a sense in which we don't actually need a shift in values. That, like, I think, rather than actually a change in our common values, we need a stronger connection with our pre-existing values.
Our deepest human values.
Because the thing about that absurd job that we have ahead of us is that it's actually not that unusual, and even like the kind of desperate situation that we're in, and the lack of real strong grounds for optimism in the face of climate change. Like there's also a sense in which that's not actually unusual. And part of what clarified this for me was reading The Road by Cormac McCarthy. And one of the central questions in that book that is kind of framed as a debate between the father and the now deceased mother who has taken her own life is whether or not it's ethical to continue to raise their child, to let this child continue to grow up in this like incredibly bleak world.
It's post-apocalyptic
Yeah.
story, right?
Right. I mean, a world probably bleaker than any climate change scenario that we're looking at, and the father kind of continues on without really being able to articulate why throughout the book. And at the end of that book, the very last page, there's this couple of chapters that are a lyrical description of the worm-eaten patterns on the back of a brook trout. And it talks about how these vermiculate patterns on the back of a brook trout map out something that has always been coming, that has always been there, and something that can't be put back and can't be made right again. And it's talking about how death is written on our bodies from the moment that we are born. And a world like The Road like makes that really obvious. It's like their death is looming in front of them every day in that kind of existence. And so they have to face that question of whether or not it's ethical to continue on when the final result is probably not going to be a positive one. Like there's not really an expectation of like everything being okay in the end. And to a lesser degree, I think that's what climate change is doing for our society, is bringing our mortality in front of our face, and showing that there might not be a positive result. Like things might not keep getting better. Like down the road, things might fall apart. And it's really scary to face that when we're looking at a civilization kind of level. But the fact is that's always been the reality of human existence. We were always going to die. And even though like we have phrases like saving someone's life and protecting someone's life and that sort of thing, like that person's still going to die. Like everyone that we fight for in our whole lives is going to die. Like everyone that we do anything for, like every little act of kindness for any person, that person is still going to die. And so if our system of meaning is based on things being okay in the end, none of that has ever made sense. Like none of our values have ever made sense if they're based on things being okay in the end. We've always been living in a world where if our values are actually going to make sense, they have to make sense in the here and now. And so that struggle for justice, that struggle for our values or for a sane climate and all of that, it has to make sense in the here and now, not just like in some positive outcome down the road.
That's beautiful. I wonder if one of the questions that arose at the beginning of Margaret's talk was, because we were talking about how this is the biggest issue of our generation. And when I think our generation is anyone alive
Yeah.
on the planet. Like, forget boomers, really millennials, like, forget it all. If you're alive, our generation's challenge is this issue. Saying, but we don't talk about it and we don't live every day like it's happening. What does it look like? She said, what does it look like to live every day like it's happening? And you do. So what is it like? I mean, what does it mean to those of us, like, we walk out of here tonight, let's try something different tomorrow morning. Let's try to live like we're aware of what's going on. What does that feel like?
I'd say at first it feels incredibly disorienting.
That's nice.
I mean, like when I first had my kind of existential wake up around this, like I can distinctly remember walking across campus, and seeing everybody like doing their thing, and just thinking like, what the fuck are all you people doing? Like, what's wrong with you people?
There's an emergency happening.
Yeah, but I think in terms of like getting past that kind of disorientation into like really living into it, to me it feels like a much deeper connection with one's values, and a certain degree of fearlessness, but that's probably not the right word. Like the fear is still there. The fear is just less relevant. The fear is just kind of silly, like most day-to-day fears, in terms of like fear of losing our reputation, or like fear of losing our money, or like fear of police, or like fear of like the state, or like fear of the fossil fuel industry, or any of that kind of stuff. Like just kind of like seems silly. So I guess it's for me, living in that reality of climate change is sort of like living with a really strong connection to a bigger picture. Yeah. And in some ways that's really liberating. For me, that period of existential despair before I was ready to take action was really a period of grieving, which was a period of like mourning the loss of my future, of the world that I thought I knew, and like, and so it was a lot of like letting go of stuff. And then I found that I was like carrying around a lot less. Like emotionally, I was carrying around a lot less. And so I felt much lighter and more liberated after that period of grieving. And much more empowered to sort of take whatever action I felt like I should be taking.
Let's ask, Margareta.
Yeah, in the movie, you had said way too often it's framed around polar bears. It's not about the planet, it's about saving human life.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if it's really at odds with what you're discounting as like acting in your own behalf. Whereas if we see it as this is our future to look at, it's in our own interest to do this. Even companies, like, you should look at your company's trajectory in 100 years and will it still exist? Is there a way to reconcile that, to like not go against this like natural seeming thing that we do?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Do you still believe that, first of all?
Yeah.
So it's about human lives. That really makes it important to me, honestly. That it's about survival.
Yeah.
Like the planet will be fine.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think what I was saying there was not necessarily about like self-interest, because I don't think that that's necessarily the most powerful motivator. I was saying like the real impacts of climate change, I think, are about human lives. So like we talk about things like sea level rise and droughts and that sort of thing. And those are like the physical impacts. we don't talk nearly as much about the human impacts of what those things actually mean in a, like within our actual human systems. So like where I'm from in the West, in Utah, there's the Colorado River system is drying up. You know, like 40 million people depend on the Colorado River for drinking water throughout California and Arizona and Nevada and Utah. And
40
Colorado.
million?
Yeah, I mean it's LA, Las Vegas, Phoenix, all of Utah, you know, cities in Colorado. And so like there's the physical impact that the changing climate is reducing the amount of water available in that river system. The human context of that is that in a place like Arizona, you've got a human phenomena of the Minutemen that are arming themselves and becoming vigilantes and shooting immigrants as they're crossing the border. And that current phenomena of the Minutemen and that kind of circle of xenophobia around them that might not have guns in their hands at the minute, but like that xenophobic phenomena is emerging without any genuine insecurity. Like the guys that are becoming Minutemen, their only insecurity is like this kind of phony insecurity of seeing their position as white men shift in the world a little bit. And that's driving them to the desperation of arming themselves and shooting people coming across the border. So when where they're living faces actual hardship that's going to come when water shutoffs come and mandatory cutbacks and that sort of thing, that's going to create actual hardship in a lot of ways in Arizona. You know, whether that's like impacting their economy or like just this sort of emotional insecurity of turning on the tap and having water not come out. Like that's going to breed some actual insecurity in that region that already has a narrative that blames all of their problems on immigrants. And so what is that kind of insecurity going to drive them to at a time when it's not just like Latin Americans that are coming across the border because they're being displaced by our economic policies and American imperialism, but it's far more refugees who are streaming to our borders because their own homes have become unlivable because of climate change, and this is still, like, for whatever hardships we're facing here, we'll still be better off than most places in the world. You know, so we'll have an order of magnitude more migrants coming in, you know, from places like Bangladesh that will be going underwater, you know, that have an even greater sense of foreignness that the xenophobes in Arizona are afraid of. So what does that mean for that social context? Like when I think about climate change, that's the kind of thing that I think about. Like how do we step into that kind of situation? And how do we hold on to our humanity in that kind of situation?
And we're seeing it with Syria.
Yeah.
I mean, we're getting little tastes.
Right. You know, and the taste that we've seen, you know, has been that people find someone else to blame. You know, like when the climate around Darfur shifted and they had several years of drought that created a lot of migration, you know, they didn't say, oh, this is climate change. Maybe we should all organize together to pressure industrialized countries to shift off of fossil fuels. You know, instead they formed into factions and blamed one another and instituted genocide. You know, and likewise in Syria, they had several years of drought that forced massive migrations from farming areas that were no longer farmable, forced that migration of millions of people into the cities, created social tension that popped off into a civil war. Like they didn't say, oh, this is climate change. Maybe we should question our oil economy. You know, instead they armed themselves and created a civil war.
How much do you think involvement in climate activists, how much do you think that's dependent on cultural attitudes towards activists? Like, activists aren't seen as like necessarily like cool or like sexy, and like how do you think we can change those?
Activists are sexy.
I mean, like, okay, like there are like I mean the people who are most involved, like politicians or whatever, I don't think they have the most power, like overall in culture, like who have the most power, like celebrities. And the kinds of movements that celebrities are making, like Miley Cyrus with like being comfortable with your body and stuff, I feel like she's not taking up more like climate related issues because it's not seen as something like necessarily attractive. What do you think about that?
I think there's plenty of like celebrity endorsers of the climate movement. That range from those that'll just sort of like put their name on things to those like Leonardo DiCaprio that do a lot of public education, and those like Daryl Hannah that'll actually get arrested and protest and that sort of thing. Yeah, Mark Ruffalo that does like actual organizing and like really spearheads some grassroots efforts. And I don't know that their efforts are all that much more powerful than regular people that organize.
I think it's also, I mean, as Margaret was saying, it's very convenient. I mean, Miley Cyrus, several times Margaret said, I'm used to being like the downer at the party or whatever. What did you say? Like, it's basically a buzzkill. I mean, it's really, on the surface. Like it can go very deep, but it's a really hard thing as a celebrity like Miley Cyrus, who's really mostly interested. I'm sure she cares about body image and she wants girls to feel good, but that's a convenient, that's an easier. I'm not downplaying what she's doing, but it's an easier thing for her to endorse. I mean, the celebrities who are behind climate change, I mean, they're in it. They're really. Like Mark Ruffalo, I think he's such a great example. I mean, he's on the front lines, and it's not really very fun. It's also not something easily solved. You don't like. How do we know we're making progress? Like Miley can bring around like a bunch. I don't know what she does. I know nothing about her work, but you can bring around a bunch of high school girls who are like turned their lives around, and then everybody feels good. I mean, we're still like, we're in it with the climate, and I don't know how you really, but all the issues are related, right? Like,
Yeah, and
it's a little bit of a stumper.
I mean, there's also different levels of what it means to be serious about climate change, and it's such a universal crisis and universal threat that really people like across all of social divisions, there's people throughout that are having that kind of existential wake-up experience about the climate crisis, because of, like, regardless of whatever anybody's position in life is, they can feel what is happening to everyone in our society. Like, no one is immune from this. And everybody like knows young people that they care about and that sort of thing. And this is truly like a form of generational oppression. That it's a form of oppression or a form of violence that is done to the young by the old. And those are always relative terms, right? So like everyone now alive is suffering oppression from those who came before us. And yet everyone now alive is reaping privilege at the expense of those who will come after us. And so I found that like you never really know who has really internalized the full reality of climate change. One of the greatest examples of that I've seen is the folks that I'm working with who started the we started the Climate Disobedience Center together. It just launched as a resource center for other people engaging in civil disobedience. They did an action a couple years ago that became known as the lobster boat blockade, where they anchored a lobster boat in front of the Brayton Point coal-fired power plant in Massachusetts and prevented a shipment of West Virginia coal from being delivered. And they were prosecuted for that, and they were taking their case to trial, and they were trying to make the necessity defense that their actions were necessitated to prevent the greater harm of climate change. And on the day of their trial, as things were getting started, like I had helped organize with them to mobilize people around their trial. We had the courtroom packed, we had tons of people outside, we had media and clergy and all that. The day of their trial, the district attorney took over the prosecution of the case. And we're all like, what is going on? What's going on? There's like these whispers back and forth. The district attorney takes over the case and then comes in and drops all the criminal charges. And then he comes out to all the people that we had gathered outside, like all the media and everything, and he gives this speech about how he dropped the charges out of concern for all the children that would be impacted by climate change. And said there's been a serious failure of political leadership on this that necessitates this kind of action. And he literally held up Bill McKibben's Rolling Stone article and said, I'm going to be in New York in a couple weeks. It was like right before the big climate march. And he said, I've been having all my staff read this article.
Wow.
Like he was, like that's, for me, a prosecutor in the age of mass incarceration is about like the last person that I would expect humane behavior from. And so seeing a district attorney come out and take our side and take bold action. I mean, like he got criticism for that. I mean, it's in a blue-collar town where there's a coal plant right there. You know, and he did something kind of bold. You know, and so the one lesson that I took from that was that you never know who kind of could be on the verge of that bold action, and also that like who knows how long he'd been thinking about that.
Yeah.
Who knows how long he was in that like limbo space until these people took action and forced him to choose a side. That was part of the critical piece of it. You know, that he didn't just like stand up arbitrarily as a district attorney and say, oh, we got to do something about climate change. You know, it wasn't until he was forced to either send these people to jail or take their side that he actually took that bold action.
So.
And wait, sorry, can I get a time check? I don't know what time it is.
8:34.
Okay, great.
So in the movie there was a part you debating with someone if you're better off in jail or outside of jail.
Yeah.
And then the movie kind of stopped the minute you go into jail, except for that thing that you were accepted into Harvard afterwards when you came out. And I was left with this gap of 2 years that I'm really intrigued about. So I guess my question, I have two questions. One of them, what is your take, like I'm sure you learn about yourself so many different things in jail, but like what is your main takeaway that made you different regarding your religion now than when you went into jail? And what good did it do that you were in jail and not the leader of the climate change outside for those activities?
So the first question, I don't think anybody's ever asked it quite that way before, like how prison impacted my religion.
People probably just ask what it was like.
Yeah, and I guess what it did was it taught me to believe in evil. And you know, I'm a Unitarian Universalist, and Unitarian Universalism doesn't necessarily have a real framework for evil, and I think I developed an understanding of what evil means for me, and that is systemic evil that is pervasive and that it infects everything that it touches, and I first saw that, like I first believed in evil when I saw The Guards, the way that they acted, and the way that they were able to dehumanize everyone that they interacted with. And to me, that's part of the essence of evil is the dehumanization of others, like that disconnect, like devaluing that inherent worth and dignity in another person, or what I would consider like that spark of divinity in another person, like anything that disconnects us or makes us not see that spark of divinity in another person, that to me is evil. And so I first saw that in the way that guards were able to just not see the humanity at all in any of the inmates. Not just like in their like most violent actions, but just in their day-to-day existence. Like the only way to continue doing their job was to not see the humanity in the inmates that they were working with. And it wasn't until a good bit after I was released that I was reflecting on that and talking about how part of my coping mechanism to deal with these guards that systematically dehumanized every inmate, like the way that I survived that was to see the guards as robots that were just programmed to be offensive, and because it's annoying to like have offensive comments or dehumanizing comments come from a machine, like the error message on your computer, like when you do something wrong, it's like, it's not right. Like that's annoying, but you're not going to actually like feel bad about yourself because a machine like devalues you. Whereas like to every day have what you see as a human being devaluing your own humanity, I think that actually has a really negative impact. And so I sort of like put up this wall of resistance of seeing these guards of like, well, if it was the one that was like delivering the food, it's like a food delivering robot. If it's like the one handing out the laundry, it's like a laundry robot. So that I didn't internalize any of that dehumanizing rhetoric or attitude coming from the guard. And I remember even giving advice to other new inmates partway through my stay who were like really struggling with dealing with it. I remember giving this advice, like just think of them as a robot. And it seems so obvious, but it took me quite a while until after I was released to understand that the way that I dealt with that situation was to systematically dehumanize the guards, to just pretend like they weren't human beings. And that was actually part of the evil. Like it was realizing that systemic evil resided not just in the guards, but in myself as well. And so for me, that was the real religious lesson there, that there is this systemic evil that doesn't reside or doesn't originate in any of us, but can infect any one of us.
So this is another tough topic, but one that actually has been coming up with, and we don't have to like go down this road, but I do think I've been talking to people recently about how ancient cultures did recognize the evil, or whatever you want to call it, in their cultures. Like the Egyptians had actually built temples to some of the darker forces, the darker deities, and we try to just keep it under wraps, like suppress it basically, which does not work because it's like a snake with many, a hydra with many heads. It exists. So if we can actually acknowledge it somehow, I don't know. Anyway, Do we want to go there or not? Anyone have a different question? I'd like to talk about that sometime further.
That might be a wild tangent.
Yeah, exactly.
From talking about climate change.
I really appreciate your discussion about narratives, and I've had some recent experiences with anarchist activists, and their narrative can be very offensive to some people, but I agree with some of their values and see a lot of alignment. And so when you're fighting against such a big system such as the fossil fuel industry, how do you shape a narrative that's honest and shows that genuine passion, but is also open to other people joining your mobilization?
Well, I think for me, one of the guiding principles is that it's not our responsibility to reach everyone, and that an effective narrative is not the same thing as a universal narrative. It's not our responsibility to make sure that everybody understands what we say. It's our responsibility to speak our truth. And I think speaking our own personal truth is generally a far more effective means of communication than any like message tested, like focus group approved kind of talking points. Because I think like regardless of the words that are coming out of our mouth, we can tell on a human level whether or not someone is speaking their personal truth. And I think we're far more likely to be motivated and convinced by someone's personal truth. Even if that's not necessarily resonant with our own personal truth. But I think where the real power comes from is when your personal truth resonates with other people's personal truths. Like those are the people who are most deeply motivated by what you say, because you validate something that has not been validated before for them. That like in addition to how we're all unique, there's also a way in which there are others who kind of share a part of our uniqueness. And so I think one way to think about it is that our responsibility or our accountability is not to everyone in terms of like speaking what we have to say. In terms of like our communication or our narrative, our responsibility is to the people who resonate with our personal truth. Because when we speak it, we empower them, we validate their experience, which is why we need a diversity of voices in the movement that come from a diversity of backgrounds and that have a diversity of personal truth that they're all speaking to mobilize a really significant movement. And yeah, so I lean much more on the side of say what you have to say, even if communications experts tell you that that's not the proper thing to be saying.
I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up unless someone has a pressing question. Okay. So Tim, what would you, just in closing, what would you offer as advice? And also, where's Peaceful Uprising? What are you up to next?
Yeah, so Peaceful Uprising kind of went down a different path and I think kind of fell apart.
Oh, okay, never mind.
And I'm working, I just launched a new organization called the Disobedience Center. It's designed to support other folks in taking bold actions. And
Where is it physically?
it doesn't have a physical location.
Oh, cool.
Most of the folks are in Boston, but they're also all over.
Okay.
And so one of the things that I learned in in my experience, is that there are people out there, there's a movement out there, there's a community out there that was far more ready to hold me than I had ever knew or understood beforehand. You know, and I took an action like without planning, and I didn't like build a safety net beforehand, but I definitely had that safety net. It was there waiting for me that I just couldn't see. And so I think it's like one of the things we're trying to do with the Climate Disobedience Center is make it known that we are there ready to support people. So kind of like as an alternative to what I was hearing when I walked in of like, how do you hold people's hand as they go through this, as they like tell them what to do. We're kind of looking at it from an alternative model of like, rather than holding people's hand, like saying like, we're here to catch you when you leak. So that's kind of the perspective that we're trying to go with, because part of our fundamental paradigm is realizing that no one has ever solved a climate crisis before. And actually no one has ever overthrown corporate power to the degree that we need to. Like, no one actually knows how to win this struggle. There's certainly a lot of lessons from our social movement history that we can learn. But there are no definitive truths about what we need to be doing. Like, there, you know, as much as I respect any leader in the climate movement, none of them can tell people what they all should be doing, because none of them really know. And we need more people taking initiative and trying things and experimenting and perhaps making mistakes, but knowing that in taking that risk, in breaking new ground, that there is a movement there to support them. That like rather than a movement there to tell them what to do, we want to build a movement to hold people in taking risks and taking leaps.
I just thought of the USO after World War II. Just like taking people in, the warriors as they come off the battlefield.
Yeah, yeah. So I would hope that what people remember is that that we really do have a movement at this point, and it's more ready to support one another than we could ever realize.
Cool, let's put it to work.
Yeah.
All right, thank you guys.